Boa tarde a todos. Bem-vindos à Escola das Artes, Universidade Católica, a uma nova Masterclass. Hoje temos o prazer de ter a presença do David Bate, um escritor, ensaísta, artista visual, um dos primeiros artistas britânicos a trabalhar com os processos digitais. Eu não me vou alongar muito. Nós, de seguida, vamos ter uma pequena palestra, falar algum espaço para algumas perguntas, e depois iremos de seguida para a exposição, a inauguração da exposição de João Paulo Serafim, que está aqui presente, e o João Paulo irá fazer uma pequena apresentação na sala de exposições, mas para não perdermos muito mais tempo, passo a palavra ao David Bate. Obrigado por terem vindo.
Thank you, Carlos. I've no idea what you said, but I'm sure it was very nice. Okay, thank you all for coming, partly because it's 6 o'clock, and also you have to listen in English. So thank you, very kind. Okay. I need some wing mirrors like a car, you know, so I can see what is on the screen. Okay, so I don't know what Carlos said, but I work as an artist, but also as a theorist or photography, sometimes involved in history. And I'm not sure what you're expecting to hear. I'm not going to talk about my own work. I'm going to talk about, well, I'll talk about that in a minute. But in a sense, the relationship between making work and thinking about work, for me, are symbiotic. They relate to one another. So I'm not talking about my own practice today, but I'm thinking about it with my thinking about photography. So if you see, it's like an indirect way of thinking about what I'm doing, but also I hope you'll see what other people are doing. The title, The Mysteries of Photography, it's not about the mystification of photography. As Roland Barthes wrote a book called Mythologies, where he discusses the idea of myth in popular culture. I don't mean that. I don't mean myth in terms of the way that Claude Lévi-Strauss talks about myth. I mean it in the old Latin word, which is mysterium, and in French, mystère. And I think you have the same words in Portuguese of misterio or romance policial. A mystery is an event without an explanation. So I'm not going to explain. I'm going to leave the mystery of what I'm going to say to the talk. I'm not going to explain what I'm going to say now. What I want to try to do is to make 2 points before I start. So I'm just trying to get my watch off so I know the time. My aim really is to introduce, or to try to introduce, a different way of thinking about the contemporary problem in photography. I also want to slightly distance myself here from the usual modes of argument of what might be called a traditional history of photography and photography criticism. And it's because I want to argue that those modes of thinking about photography, developed so long ago now, are in some way also an obstacle to thinking about photography today. Historians of photography tend to focus on developing a narrative of photographers and photographs from the early beginnings of photography in the 19th century through the 20th century to the contemporary. These stories, which are often focused on national histories, aesthetic themes, sometimes other categories like particular location, say Paris, or subject matter like portraits or self-portraits or war photography. They pick these out and they set out to construct a kind of list of them, historical list of them, that is taken to suppose the unfolding of a singular logic of photography, a thing called photography. Writers in this model of history thus write a chronicle of men, and occasionally women, who have earned their place there because they can be claimed to have made or mark an achievement in that narrative of the thing we call photography. Curiously, this same model is also often used for writing counter-histories. So the people who set out to challenge precisely those orthodox histories of photography use the same technique. So, for example, the history of feminist literature in photography quite often does exactly the same thing. It starts at the beginning and traces the women photographers and constructs a sort of line forward to the contemporary, a timeline of identifiable women photographers from the past to present. Different content, the same method. In a way, all these modes of writing on photography tend to repress, for want of a better word, what I would call the past. Now, you might think the history of photography and the past are identical, but they're not at all. I mean by this the past as it was experienced. I mean, people didn't experience photography in the way that people write about it in the history of photography. This is all sort of retrospective construction. In the history of photography, this notion of the past, of how it was experienced, is everything that gets in the way of the linear narrative of the history of photography. So, like in a railway metaphor, the history of photography is like a series of train stations, and it's sort of a line that takes you from one to the other. And in doing so, you pass through things missing life. And quite often, the way that those photographers are selected are based on current ideas rather than thinking back in terms of history. And quite often, some of the innovative ideas that have come up where people have used this same narrative, they pick a contemporary type of image and then go back through history to find the back catalogue to that type of work. This is not really anything worth calling history. It's more like the CV of a topic. It's nothing like as it was experienced. And nor is it conducive to thinking about photography today, what it actually does. These forms of history compile a kind of grand narrative for photography that inevitably excludes many things that complicate those simple linear histories. So no matter how valuable all of those histories are, and I do value them, it seems to me they have actually become a kind of a problem and an obstacle to understanding the role of photography in culture today. The main alternative to that approach is photography criticism, where a critic engages more or less directly with a work by a photographer or a group of photographers, perhaps as they're presented in an exhibition or in a book. This model of criticism, or reviewing, as it's often called, offers itself as a critique set up by the person doing it, who thus becomes the critic, a type of person, an expert who invariably proposes a kind of master discourse for those photographs. There, the critic explains to their reader why they must take these particular photographs seriously or why they should not. Or, for example, how the photographs do or do not manifest particular characteristics of beauty, political awareness, sublime anxiety, trauma, and so on. It's a highly individualistic practice, yet collectively, these reviews play a key role in the marketplace of photographic criticism, consumption, and circulation of pictures. If you like, they grease the interface between the photographic work and the public. When a work is reviewed, it's seen to validate the work, regardless of whether the critic is writing positively or negatively. I mean, it's very well known amongst people who study this that the audience numbers for an exhibition will typically double if it's been reviewed, regardless of the review. I know this from my own experience in the UK, of my own work, for example. These two modes of writing about photography, the sort of linear history of photography and photography criticism, actually kind of support one another. It's as though the critics do the sort of foundation digging. They find works and talk about them, which raises their profile in the press and so forth over history. And the historian joins them up in a kind of a long story. Now, I'm merely trying to describe the predominant ways in which the writing on photography has developed, or some might even say degenerated. There are people who try to combine these two together, which you might call a critical history. But there are very few of them around, and they tend to be neither historical nor critical. I'm not criticizing these modes. I'm just trying to describe how they work. And I'm not really interested to go on and critique them fully here, partly because those criticisms have already been made extensively, but because I actually want to draw on them for what I want to say today. That's my first point. My second point is really to address, in a rather maybe obtuse way, the category of post-truth that has been much thrown about these days. The assumption is that we are in an age of post-truth. I guess you've heard this, which assumes it is our contemporary condition. So this notion of post-truth proposes that something, presumably something else, presumably called truth, is now overshadowed by something else, which we now call post-truth. I'd like to challenge this category, but without rejecting the issues that it gives rise to, that is our relation to notions of fact, rationality, certainty, and truth. The fact that the term post-truth appeared in the dictionary for the first time in 2016 and was also word of the year, whatever that means that post-truth is an idea in popular currency and circulation. You know, we should take the fact that it's included in the dictionary as a sign of its importance in popular circulation. It doesn't mean that it's true. The function of the dictionary, certainly the Oxford English Dictionary, is to include words that have such a popular currency that it's important that they recognize as part of contemporary vocabulary. It doesn't in any way validate or confirm that the arguments made by such a proposition are true. Post-truth is like a number of other posts, which you are probably also familiar. Post-photography, post-medium condition, post-human theories, and of course that term that probably some people blame for all of these other posts, postmodernism. And a student sent me a proposal the other day which described us as being in the age of post-internet. So it's like, oh, that's interesting. I don't know what post-internet is. I thought we were kind of still in it. You see this kind of fascination and interest that we are in some post-moment. so that it's like the sort of morning after the night before of the party. We've woken up with a hangover. We don't know where we are or what's going on. And we're post something, some event. It's already happened, and we're in the after moment of that. I'm going to a conference in a few weeks in Russia, which is called After Post Photography. I'm very keen to hear what after post photography actually is. Well, you hear this kind of sense in the culture of, particularly in cultural journalism, of us being in some moment that is very different from another moment, which is called something else. And you can kind of see this in book titles. There's a friend of mine who's always talking about how in the late 60s, all of the books were called Beyond or Towards. Now we're very much in the sort of after. There's like some sort of narrative, which relates back, if you like, to what I was starting out with, the history of photography. How does a specific moment come about, and what is this moment called post-truth then? It's clear that post-truth makes a kind of melodramatic claim for the abandonment of truth and certainty, that somehow rationality has dropped out. So in post-truth, truth, conceived as rationality, is superseded by something else we call post-truth. We used to have truth, but now we have something else that is not called truth. So incoherently, to define the moment as post-truth requires a certain stepping outside of the moment we are in to see that we are in a moment of post-truth. The very definition of post-truth depends on an ironic return of the press of precisely the notion of truth that it claims no longer exists. So you see my point. To claim we're in a point of post-truth is to make a claim for a kind of truth. So it's a kind of reassertion of precisely the thing that it's trying to negate. What all this seems to be really about is a kind of quasi-historical category, post-truth, which has actually been around for a decade, but it seems to have gained popularity in the era of Trump, if you believe in such a thing. To sort of usher in certain preferences about what we should believe, which in fact, as I've said, is a reassertion of certain notions of truth that have in fact always been highly problematic. The construction of truth we learned long ago from Michel Foucault is dependent on certain productions of knowledge and belief established upon ideologies and discourses of power and knowledge. Why is all this relevant to photography? Well, because photography has been so central to the representation of what we still call reality, even if some people claim we're in an era of post-truth. I'm not saying that photography represents reality, but it's certainly mobilized to construct it in ways that connect certain notions of knowledge and belief. And very clearly, the kind of anxiety about reality that post-truth creates and is perhaps a response to is not new either. Actually, the dictionary definition of post-truth is of a state where public opinion or popular belief is driven more by emotion than by the rational. And I don't know when that has not been the case, but still. What that sets apart is two registers. Emotion, in a sense, subjective feelings of humans, and the notion of the rational, which is deemed to exclude those emotions. Or to put that in sort of the classical philosophical terms, it's subjectivity and objectivity, right? Highly problematic terms. I want to argue that these are both registers in which knowledge and truth appear, and that in fact they are dependent on each other. In other words, instead of seeing emotion and the rational as a binary opposition, as feeling opposed to fact or interpretation opposed to truth, these registers operate one upon the other simultaneously. I also want to suggest that that binary opposition of emotion and rationality has operated in photography from the beginning and continues to be one of the issues that needs to be addressed in terms of this idea of post-truth. Because I think that that is the problem that haunts the idea of post-truth. So, now I'm going to just finally show you some images. It's a kind of interesting that this distinction of rationality and emotions becomes fundamental historically at the beginning of the 19th century, at the same time that photography is invented. Actually, if we look around when photography invented in the 1830s, there are things beginning to happen, I mean, specifically in England as an industrialized country. The railways, the coming of the railways transformed the world for the first time in a way it hadn't before. In England, for example, the time was different in London and Oxford. So if you had a train, you had to synchronize the time in these different cities for the first time. The universalization of time began in the 19th century because of the railways that one had to join them up. This is an important transformation. Photography, the invention of photography, is kind of linked to this moment of the invention of rationality in relation to the nation state. On one side of the invention of photography is positivist philosophy, and this is not an abstract industry, if you like. It was, through Auguste Comte in France, a theory of knowledge based on the scientific organization of society. So, for example, statistics comes to really form part of the establishment of what Mary Bouvier has called the modern fact. In English tradition, quite specifically, these thinkers were very hostile to religion and metaphysics and wanted to replace these with what we now call rationality. So in other words, the statistics of the population, the notion of what needs to be done was based not on some abstract metaphysical theology or political ideology, but centered around the idea of statistics. What are the numbers of people who are in poverty, who have access to water and so forth? This is crucial at precisely the time of the invention of photography. On the other side of this, and this is really what started me thinking about this talk, is the invention of the detective novel in 1841, at the same time as photography. So photography and detective fiction were born at exactly the same time. But so were statistics. So you see, photography, if you look across to what was happening in photography, instead of this linear line, if you look across to the moment that photography is invented, you start to see how the discussions about what photography is and what it can do in that moment are linked in a way to some of those other issues that are coming out. So photography, the invention of photography appears in the midst of this new positivist science, as it's called, of rationalism and detective. So, if I turn finally to a picture, you'll be glad to see. This is the cover of William Henry Fox Talbot's book, The Pencil of Nature. It's regarded as the first published photography book. Anna Atkins had a book, but this is the first published photography book, published in 1841. I'll show you one picture from it, which is this. And this is more or less the layout of it with the text and the picture. So this is, I think this picture was taken in 1840, appears in the book in 1841. I'm going to read you the text that Talbot writes with it. He says, from the specimen here given, it is sufficiently manifest that the whole cabinet of a collector of old china might be depicted on paper in little more time than it would take him to make a written inventory describing it in the usual way. The more strange and fantastic the forms of his old teapots, the more advantage in having their pictures given instead of their descriptions. And should a thief afterwards purloin the treasures, steal them, if the mute testimony of the picture were to be produced against him in court, it would certainly be evidence of a novel kind. But what the judge and jury might say to it is a matter which I leave to the speculation of those who possess legal acumen. This is the first book of photography, and Fox Talbot is anticipating forensic photography, the photograph, as a site for evidence in court. The articles represented on this plate are numerous, he says, and he goes on to describe the technical process of making them. You have here in Fox Talbot's mind and picture and the book the whole construction of a positivist idea of photography, that the photograph might lend itself to evidence in, for example, a court. This is long before forensic photography was invented. Now, what's interesting about Fox Talbot's pictures is these were not taken on a bookshelf in his house. All of these things are his, but because there's no light in 1841 indoors sufficient to take a picture, he took all of these objects outside and constructed what looks like a shelf in his garden. So, in a sense, at some basic level, these pictures are already a fiction, in a sense. I mean, they're real objects, but they're already reconstructed. Now, at the same time that he's doing this, Edgar Allan Poe writes the first detective fiction novel. Detective fiction, I mean, mystery stories are ancient. They exist since the Middle Ages. But there's something specific about the romance policier. I apologize for my pronunciation. The key characteristic of detective stories and spy stories, which is the inheritor of the detective stories, and this is whether it's a book, a novel, a film, or TV series, or any other theatrical form, is that in detective fiction, it is rationality that prevails. The solution to the crime is discovered through deduction, through rational deduction. It uses a certain logic, and of course Sherlock Holmes is the famous one. So none of these stories, in what defines the detective stories as a cultural form and genre, is that they put aside magic, supernatural explanations, ghosts, devils, evil spirits, and so on. So even though the stories may flirt with those things, so for example, in the Edgar Allan Poe story, the detective, Mr. Dupin, finds a hair which is not from a human. And the story is centered, the very first story is centered around the murder of two women, like as most detective stories focus around murder. That the first clue is a non-human hair. So the tantalizing idea is that this is a crime committed by something strange, some weird extraterrestrial beast or something. So you have the sense of, and the discovery through the story is deducted back to rationality, that this is a human crime in a human context. So we have this tradition from Sherlock Holmes, written by Arthur Conan Doyle, and the many others who followed, The Phantom of the Opera, the ubiquitous Agatha Christie, Poirot, and hundreds of others. And this evolved into the spy novel, which took the same theme, but articulated at the level of the state. So, these forms, and the first spy story is John Buchanan's The 39 Steps movie, which was immortalized, in a sense, also by Alfred Hitchcock's film of the same name. And Hitchcock is the master of suspense. Sociologists have recently started to write about these as a way to think about how we think about reality. That the detective story and the popular thrill of them, I guess all of you, to show how popular it is, pretty much everybody has come across a detective story or spy thriller, James Bond. Even if you don't like them, you can't avoid them somehow culturally. They are culturally pervasive. They are now almost totally universal globally. And one of the reasons for their popularity, it can be said, is that they draw on conventional reality, but they seem to test it at the same time. They ask questions about it. So, if you like, the thrill of detective fiction is the mystery in the reality. So you see how these things start to come together. I said at the outset that a mystery is an event without an explanation. The function of a mystery story is to give an explanation of the event that has happened. And detective fiction always comes back to rationality. If you think of TV series like X-Files, for example, there's a point at which they flip over into the other genre that we would call the fantastic. So movies and stories where you have superheroes like Batman and Superman. These have all the characteristics of rationality, but they don't have, there are things in it which don't subscribe to the rules of rationality. So for example, Superman can fly, and no one thinks that's really very strange. So you don't have that in detective fiction. And if you like, that's the borderline between detective fiction and the fantastic. And the fantastic as a genre, if you like, of fantasy, monsters and devils, which of course religious discourses have used for a long time, still exist. But so what I'm thinking about is specifically genres of practice which are to do with factuality, if you like. And the detective genre is the clearest one that works towards it. So, we have a very clear link between the detective genre and photography, specifically through the idea of the crime scene. And there are many, many examples of this in the history of photography, whether it is fictional or fact, in the sense this is Ouija, the New York photographer, who spent his time chasing ambulances to get photographs of crimes before and after. So these are, if you like, crime scene photographs by a reporter. They're not forensic photographs taken by the police, which has much more developed, refined, specific rules. Sorry, I keep going backwards on this. Yeah. And there's a great exhibition catalogue called Scenes of the Crime, which put together a whole range of artists who have used the crime scene as the basis of their work. It has two fantastic essays in as well by Peter Woolen and Ralph Rogoff. And I'll just show you two works from that. One is, you probably know Paul McCarthy's work. This is from his early work. This is Abigail Lane. She constructs installations, which they're also photographic, but quite complex constructions of these bodies. So this is a very famous work by John Hilliard. It's often used to demonstrate to students how cropping a photograph can change the meaning of the picture. I'm sorry, it's not a great reproduction, but it's one picture that has got four. It's a single frame that has four different crops, and the text next to each crop. Well, you can see it's a body wrapped up on a beach. So the top right one rather says drowned. The one underneath it on the right says fell. The one at the bottom left says burnt because it's a fire. And the top one, actually I forgot what that one is. But you see how the crop can change the meaning because the crop includes the body and a fire, body and height and so forth. Very famous work. Now, crime scene photographs don't necessarily include the body as well. It's important to say. Forensic photographs quite often photograph the space in which a crime has happened. Okay, so if you read a crime novel or watch a crime movie, the story inevitably unfolds because these are time-based arts. In photography, or even painting, it's a space-based art. There is no temporality to the picture in relation to the event. So we might say, in fact, I think we have to, theoretically, it's right to say there's something specific to crime scene, the idea of this type of space in photography, because there is no unveiling of the mystery. If you have a classic story, someone's been murdered, the detective follows the clues, there'll be a number of suspects who are kind of tantalizingly suggested to you as the villain. You're already active as a spectator thinking, oh, is it him or her, or who did it? And then the story will tell you. With the still photograph, there's no narrative. The still photograph does not narrate. It's static, it's mute. There's nothing to reveal. The revelation, if there is one, would only come from your own imagination, from your own spectatorial activity in thinking about the pictures. You know, there's no moment like in Agatha Christie novels where all the characters are assembled in the drawing room and she explains how the murder was made and who the villain is. You don't get any of that in photography. So there's something specific about this in terms of photography. And there's also something about showing something which is not explained, which is interesting and attractive. This is the picture from the Louvre Museum in Paris in 1911, when a thief stole the Mona Lisa painting. One August day, the Guardian suddenly realized the painting was no longer there. This was reported in the papers. La Gioconda, the Mona Lisa we call it in English, is stolen. For the next few months, there were hundreds of people who queued up to see this space, to see where the painting was. They didn't come to see it when it was there, they came to see it when it was missing. That somehow the emptiness of the space created a mystery which drew them in. It turned out to be, sorry, I keep going backwards, very annoying. And they caught the guy, an Italian, very nicely. He was photographed in the famous police photographer Bate, who invented forensic photography, that you would keep archives of criminals. He's photographed by him here. It's very nice to see. And caught a couple of years later, and here they are with the famous painting retrieved. Oh, damn. Okay. Now, the most famous photographer that is talked about in the scene of the crime in photography is Eugene Ache. If you're a photography student and you don't know Ache, then I won't ask if you don't, but you should know his work. He's the first photographer to have an exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art. In a sense, he founded modern art photography. He himself was not an art photographer. He said he made documents for artists. And he photographed relentlessly around Paris. This is actually his study where he worked. You can see it's not often shown, so I thought I'd show that. That's where he sold his pictures from. Documents for artists. It's how he made his living, was to sell pictures to anybody. By artists, he mean like craftspeople, designers, anyone who wanted a picture of something that they could use for their work. And his work was published in 3 editions, in German, English, and French at the same time of his exhibition. In 1939, at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. There's a picture of him. And it's very interesting that the person who wrote the catalogue essay for his work, Pierre-Mac Allan, was a champion of what he called the social fantastic. His idea was that the very experience of the city is itself a mystery because we don't understand it. So whereas the government thinks of the city in terms of statistics, population, etc., he was trying to advocate the notion of the city as a mystery. We constantly see, in a sense, this binary distinction between, if you like, the subjective experience of a thing as a mystery, and at the same time, the notion of the rational. Now, let me just get to this. I'm going to skip this. The surrealists, of course, became very preoccupied with Eugene Ache's work. But I just want to draw this together with commentary by Walter Benjamin, 2 commentaries on Eugene Ache's work. He is probably the most important early photography critic. and still very rich in terms of what he said. But he talks in two essays, an essay called The Short History of Photography, and the much more famous text, The Work of Art, The Age of Mechanical Reproduction, which all first-year students who used to be asked to read. I don't know if they still are. And he makes these comments about Ache's photographs. Not for nothing have Ache's shots been compared with those of a crime scene. Now, Ache was not interested in crime. He photographed the old, decaying parts of Paris. He photographed the tourist parts of Paris. He started from the center and worked outwards. And as Paris was being rebuilt, gentrified, it's an eternal process, he photographed the old areas. And some of these pictures I'm showing you here. And he's not the first. That a lot of people had somehow come up with this idea that Ache's pictures, which Ache says are documents, they're just information, they're informational, that people could see in them some sort of crime scene, some sort of mystery, some sense of there being some events taking place there, having taken place already or to be taken place. And he goes on to say, but is not every spot in our cities a crime scene? Every passerby a perpetrator? Should not every photographer expose guilt on their pictures and identify the guilty? Actually, I was astonished when I reread this. I'd never noticed that he talks about this, that we should, the photographer is like a kind of vigilante police person who should report through photography what they see as crimes. It's a quite astonishing that Benjamin imagines the photographer not so much as a detective investigating a crime scene, but as a vigilante civilian policing the activities of his or her neighbors. That you should report to the police, expose guilt, and identify the guilty, precisely the terms that he uses. So it's made me think that what if we sort of stood back from the specificity of the detective novel and the crime scene? Actually, these pictures aren't crime scenes anyway. And think about that scenario of the relationship between factuality and evidence and mystery. I'm going to quote from Peter Woolen, who wrote one of the essays in that Scene of the Crime catalogue, where he says, "The detective sees the crime scene as a place of opportunity, the site of obsessive curiosity, observation, and interpretation. The criminal sees the crime scene as a place of ritual transgression, the site of manic enjoyment and accomplishment of evil. The victim, dead, sees nothing. The victim is blind. Perhaps the victim is still there, inert, lifeless, hacked to pieces, stuffed in a trunk. The onlooker sees the scene as a place of transient spectacle, the site of morbid fantasy and distracting shock." We might equally consider then how any spectator, or the photographer for that matter, may imagine, fantasize, or identify themselves within any of these four positions when looking at a photograph. As one might imagine in a daydream, as a detective, as a criminal, as a victim, as an onlooker. And in fact, one of the things about photography and pictorial images which don't have a narrative, where you are led through the story through the pictures. If you've just got the picture, you can fantasize your relation to that image and where you are. You can put yourself in the image to be part of it, to be one of the actors in the scene, and so on. Now, just to get out of that historical scene, I want to show you these pictures by Annika von Hauswolf, who's a Swedish artist who came to fame, in a sense, with these pictures of called Back to Nature. And so if you think that Scandi noir was always, is a recent phenomenon, it's already here back in the 90s, where she's interested in the idea of a mystery and the relation of the crime scene photograph to the woman's body, specifically the woman's body, as it's so often used in crime drama, and the opposition that is usually constructed there still between women and nature and men and culture, and in a way parodying that in a quite gripping way, an explicit way. So these are all her pictures. They're all shot in Sweden. This is Swedish photography, if you like. And this picture, which is, I think, the first picture of work of hers that I'd seen in London, has echoes of the John Hilliard picture, but is really quite different. And it has a title, which is, "Hey Buster, what do you know about desire?" So it's sort of extraordinary. You have this, looks like a body in the yellow. You have the sand that's churned up as though there's been a struggle of some kind. You don't know what. There's a dog that you would associate with maybe a police dog or a customs dog or etc. You see these dogs in movies, the characters. Hey Buster, what do you know about desire? Who's Buster? Is it the dog? Is it the... So in a sense there's no narrative, but there are components that the spectator begins to work like a detective. So that in a sense, the whole kind of construction of the mystery becomes a space where you can discover something about reality. This is the sort of argument that sociologists have made about the function of detective fiction. And in a sense, because detective fiction is actually premised on real life, that the distinction between these sort of fields that we make, if you like, between detective fiction and real life are much less than we would imagine. I mean, actually, if you're a journalist in the USA right now, I heard a journalist say the other day, every time the president tweets, I, want to get a big tub of popcorn out, because it's like being at the movies. It's like an unbelievable story of, I couldn't anticipate that plot shift. So the plot shift, if you like, is equal in these different fields. But it strikes me that we might also consider that actually perhaps this offers us something for a way of thinking about spectatorship for all photographs, for how we as spectators are active or passive in relation to the activity of making a photograph have a meaning. So, if I can kind of, draw this together, that a detective is a kind of cipher for a way of investigating social situations that have psychological causes. social and psychological are kind of brought together. The detective is somewhere between an obsessive neurotic who is constantly doubting the truth of something, on the one hand. The obsessional neurotics are constantly doubting, and you start to realize we operate with quite a low threshold of the notion of reality, because as soon as someone starts to question it, the cards fall down quite quickly. On the other hand, is the eternal questions of the paranoic, who has always understood that there's some other story behind the surface appearance of things. So that we might see the detective as a sort of figure operating, if you like, on the one hand as an obsessive, curious person who's always investigating the surface of things for other meanings, and on the other side of that is the paranoid who sees a conspiracy, that sees things being done behind what we see. Then we have, if you like, the criminal viewer who enjoys the image for its transgression, in a sense, and so forth with the same with the victim and the onlooker, if you like, the passive onlooker who sees it as a spectacle but has no kind of emotional investment in it, except from morbid curiosity. And this is also Annika von Hesswolf's image. And it's not an image linked to detective fiction in any way, but I think as an art picture, you can see how the notion of mystery here, if you bring what I've been saying to an image like this, what is this child doing with a chainsaw? Yeah. What is that? What is that picture? You don't normally see children with chainsaws, not even in Sweden. What is that? Is this something that's going to happen? Is it something that has happened? In a sense, the picture depends on this duality that often in photography criticism is written into an opposition between fiction and fact, between what one imagines it means and what one can see. If we undo that binary and see how they lean on each other, we can begin to perhaps understand what is operating inside the idea of post-truth, of why post-truth seems to be meaningful, because it seems to be trying to recognize that binary opposition as somehow folding in on itself. So the long historical problem of photography as a fact that started with Fox Talbot with that picture, but of course Fox Talbot also sets off other avenues by claiming that photography can be an art in that book as well. He claims many things for photography in that book. That's why it's so amazing to look at. That we have to undo this binary in a way to kind of recognize what's happening in the contemporary discussions of photography. And this example, which has now become a kind of default example for the discussion of post-truth, the photographic comparison between President Trump's ceremony and Obama's ceremony as to the size of the photographs, the size of the crowds and the photographs, has kind of brought this all out. And in fact, it was really my starting point for this talk, but I didn't want to put it in because it's such an example that has its own kind of, there's a lot to talk about in relationship to this image. But in fact, a lot of the assumptions about the argument that came from this, I mean, I don't know if you're familiar with it, but incredibly briefly, in case you weren't, that after the ceremony, the newspapers were reporting that Trump ceremony didn't have as many people as Obama's first ceremony, and the first press briefing, the press officer, Sean Spicer, attacked the journalists for being so negative and saying they were wrong. And then other press officers saying, well, the photographs seem to show that there are more people at Obama's, but we were drawing on alternative facts. And, you know, the journalists were horrified because for them, the photography is a fact. Here you have precisely that dynamic between the emotional response that relates to your belief and the relation to fact. And you can see how there's something else here that's needs to be discussed in relation to that dynamic. So I think I should probably stop there and leave it hanging without a resolution, as in the classic mystery. So thank you for listening.
Thank you. Thank you for this amazing presentation. And before going into some questions from the audience, I would just like to go around this idea that I got from the presentation, which is this idea that photographs do not need to unfold the story or to explain or to unveil its meaning. And I think that its power lies precisely on that, on its power to suggest different narratives, different stories. And the question is, can photography still create or validate facts, or was it ever able to do that?
Thank you. Yeah. I mean, photography can't narrate. There's a long debate in the history of art about painting, whether painting could narrate or not. And I think the answer was no, but it can suggest. Because a narrative is a sequence of events, and a photograph can only show a fragment. I mean, you know, classically, the notion of the decisive moment from Cartier-Bresson, that's thought of as something to do with photography, you know, clicking the button, but it has a history in art of the pregnant moment. That is the moment of a story that should be painted, when the transition from one, you know, the decisive moment, well, I think that notion of the pregnant moment, the moment of anticipation of what is to come, is the moment that should be depicted. That's what the decisive moment was really about in that sense. To allow, to depict a moment or scene that allows your mind to run back and forward from the moment that you see, that you can imagine what happens next or what had got to that. So the child with the chainsaw, the fact it's all clean is really important. There's no blood, for example. So you know they haven't killed anyone or done anything with that chainsaw. It's immaculate. So, for example. So the temporality, the spatiality of the image is how it can evoke or suggest narrative, but it can't actually narrative. You need a sequence of photographs for a narrative to exist. We tried to teach this for a long time in photography. So Jeff Wall, his work relies on that decisive moment in a way. He works with that tableau or the pregnant moment idea. That was the first part. that you were asking about. And your question?
It's a tricky question because I'm asking if it was it ever able to become a fact?
Yeah. No. There's an argument that a photograph in a court of law has never proved anything. Every time a photograph is presented in the court, it requires the photographer to authorize that they are the author of the photograph, that they were there, that they took it. And I don't know if you have any forensic photographers now, but forensic cameras have a special chip so the data cannot be affected or played with in the camera. But still the photographer is required to go to the court. I mean, if you think of the judicial system as an arbiter of truth, which actually maybe we shouldn't, it doesn't. This idea of the photograph as a fact, this is a very interesting example, because the idea of this photograph being a fact depends on counting numbers of people. And it's true, there are other methods to count people than the photograph that would provide different evidence. So you could say it's a system that we use for truth, for facts, but in fact, there's this wonderful book by Mary Poovey on the history of the modern fact, where she claims the fact, the idea of a fact, is a mode of representation, nothing else. And the fact that we are so hooked into it, into the belief of it, it's to do with kind of modern cultural condition. It's not, I don't quite know how to say this, it sounds like I'm sort of becoming a heretic, particularly to an audience of photographers, to say that photography is not a fact. But it's the notion of a fact is a problem, I think. You can see from the Fox Talbot example how kind of tenuous that is.
That's why we have the expression, I have to see it with my own eyes to believe it. So
yeah.
we don't believe when we see it through other people's eyes. Yeah.
And this is part of the whole positivist thing that, in science, the idea of observation was crucial. Photography is invented at precisely this time as a machine for observation. So it belongs to that. It does belong to that logic. But I think we've learned over the years that we shouldn't trust photographs. And I haven't talked at all about social media, but it seems very clear to me that the impact of that, of everybody understanding, oh, I can photograph it like this or like that. People begin to understand that you are kind of constructing something with the camera at some level. It's always a set of choices. It's always a set of, I'd say manipulation if that word wasn't so loaded in terms of, say, propaganda. Yeah, and in fact, there is no neutral fact. There is no neutral truth in that sense. And it's interesting that popular motto, how's it go? There are facts, lies. No, there are lies, damn lies, and statistics. And statistics as a sort of form of fact is the most abused notion of fact in everyday media. How often do you hear someone quote the same statistical report to mean completely different things? It's the same is entirely possible with photographs. I'm old enough to remember the Rodney King case in Los Angeles, where 4 policemen were caught on video beating to death Rodney King. It was played in court. The 4 white police officers were acquitted. And that's what caused the LA riots in 1992. The visible evidence, the lawyer was able to argue that there was a motivation for that. So this is depressing, but...
Yeah. I think now I'll open the debate to the audience. So if anyone wants to ask a question.
So do you regard Annika von Auschwitz as a criminal? That's my question.
Whether... Oh. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, that's a very nice point. I wouldn't like to accuse her of being a criminal, but you could say she has a criminal mind. Yeah. Yeah, and maybe that's a way to be a kind of rebel if you're a woman artist in a world that's dominated by men artists, is to be a criminal. Yeah, she uses, you know, classically the victim. Maybe, yeah. I'm not keen on autobiographical, you know, psychobiographical readings, but I see where you're going. Yeah. Yeah, I thought that was quite liberating to have that list of 4, and actually I would quite like to do some more work on that as a spectatorial, as a model for thinking about spectatorship. It was quite refreshing to think about that.
Any other question?
Well, can you hear me? Well, thanks so much for the fascinating talk. Really wonderful. I mean, we could start by just invoking Nietzsche and say, you know, 2 people call something a fact if they share.
Sorry, you're fading here and there.
Okay, so I'm saying that 2 people can call something a fact if they share the same perspective, so to speak, you know, invoking Nietzsche. But I wonder if we could go back to your 4 categories or your 4 subjective positions of regarding a scene, so to speak. And I'm wondering if you think of if there's one missing, which could be, say, the category of the scholar or the historian, you know, the one that negotiates the other 4, you know, the one that puts things in perspective, the one that values whether an image is representative of an era, you know, one that makes sure that something tiny is not made into huge and huge made into tiny, like Fox News would. And so I was wondering, I mean, someone like yourself, so to speak, who are you in terms of where do you position yourself as a viewer in regards to those 4 categories?
No, you're totally right. Thank you for that. No, it's the judge is missing, the court is missing. Yeah, and maybe the university. Yeah, no, that's a point. But I guess I would want to resist that notion of a sort of master position a little. But thank you, that's a very nice point. Maybe, I think the judge, I would like to include the judge in the courtly, you know, so thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah. So I don't want to drag the question for very long because it actually ties up some of your points. I can talk from the photography point of view because I'm not a photographer and I've never worked, so I can only talk from a consumption point of view because I'm not a creator. But I'm very interested in postmodernism and post-truth, especially in the ramifications of politics and sociology, but also in terms of art consumption. So, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. I also don't want to, go into a binary discussion of truth or false. But when you talk about post-truth, from my understanding, it's also kind of a negation of classical terms and also a rupture from a lot of notions and a lot of facts as well. And I think it's very important, but I also think about it from the kind of point of view of, if you talk about like chaos and order, for example, and you can think that chaos, for example, is more left-leaning in terms of politics, where order is more right-leaning. And it also normally means that when you're in chaos, pretty much what you're doing is you're rejecting the usual terms and facts, and when you're on the order side, you really need those definitions to actually make sense of the world. And when I try to consume art, what I try to think about is, when I'm on the order side, I kind of am looking at the technical aspects and what is classically defined as beautiful, for example. But when you're on the chaos side, you're trying to look about it from more of like an emotional point of view. And my question pretty much is, if you lean on too much on the post-truth side, especially on the kind of the interpretation from post-truth of, for example, photography, can you get to the point where you don't have enough structure so that you cannot actually, I don't know, try to value things the right way, kind of? I don't know if I could explain it myself.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. I mean, yeah, I'll be trying to be brief as well. That this is the example that I've already read a couple of essays on as examples of post-truth. And so the argument is, the photograph very clearly shows factually that Trump's ceremony didn't have more people than Obama's. And people go through, these photographs were produced by the National Park Service, who apparently photograph things there all the time. So it's established rules. So this is already kind of the trap that everyone's fallen into. That like the apparatus of photography is the arbiter of truth here. Well, actually, I mean, you can't actually see people for a start. What you can see are shapes that we make assumptions about as being. Don't get me wrong, I'm not a Trumpian. My point is not to support Trump with this. But the rush to say that we're in post-truth because people no longer believe what they see doesn't recognize how truth is constructed. And when they said we used alternative facts, probably what they should have said, we have alternative beliefs. In fact, that, belief and cognition or recognition have always been a kind of problematic structure. My argument is that to call this post-truth is to build on the ashes of something called truth, a notion of truth, because post-truth has a notion that there is such a thing as post-truth. So it's reinventing what it has assumed is no longer there in its very formulation. And the idea in the dictionary definition, which is, emotion has basically got the better of rationality, which is true of Trump supporters in this, is that, well, okay, they're both taking it at 12 o'clock, but, people arrived later for the Trump ceremony. And anyway, the first mistake is, who cares? What on earth does it matter how many people? That's no index of Trump's or any president's ability. Certainly doesn't mean that Obama was a better president because there were more people at the ceremony. So the whole logic of fact that informs that discussion that photography has kind of got caught up in negates the whole field of belief and values that are so clearly polarized in relation to I mean, as you were saying, that we can agree on a fact when we both come from the same position. It's basically, is that a glass of water there? Yes, okay. Well, that's not contentious, but when it gets to things, it's highly contentious. So, yeah, I'm not sure I'm convinced by the arguments of post-truth, in other words. I'm very convinced by the arguments of postmodernism, which is the fracturing of the so-called grand narratives. And it feels to me that the state, or the nation states, I mean, that doesn't apply to totalitarian regimes, but nation states like Britain, England, Scotland has different law, it's a different country in many ways, that England was based on the notion of a kind of rational logic that employs statistics for the basis of law and democratic government. And you can kind of feel that notion of fact is beginning to kind of crumble. The authority of it is beginning to crumble. And to that extent, the notion of post-truth seems kind of valid. But I mean, that whole thing is connected to a whole range of things we don't have time to go into, including social media, in the sense that groups of opinion that are far more fragmented than they ever were before, which Jean-Francois Lyotard was arguing would happen with computerized societies, has come to pass. Anyway, I should probably stop there because you're all thirsty and want to look at some real pictures.
We have the exhibition just to open now, so sorry if there are any more questions. David will be with us in our gallery, so we can all talk to him. And now I'd like to invite you all to come to the gallery and to see João Paulo, the Serafim exhibition. Abrimos então, fechamos aqui a conferência e passamos então para a sala de exposições. Temos todo o gosto com a vossa presença também na inauguração da exposição. Obrigado a todos.